Hello, everybody. How are you? Yes. Are we ready for setting the scene? So with me, I have, via Zoom, we have Anusha Dore, who is NITV and a critical member of Screen Australia's Gender Matter Task Force. So welcome. So glad to see you. I'm so sorry you're not here in person. And over here, in this corner of the ring, we have the wonderful Lisa French, who is the Dean of RMIT Media and Communications. So good to see you. And I'm Madeline. I have the privilege of running the Geena Davis Institute on Gender and Media, and you will be seeing my boss in a few hours, so that's super, super exciting. And I want to get right into it. So this panel is about kind of setting the scene. Where is the state of the industry? And actually, before Lisa and Anusha get into it, I thought I would share some data just from the US, and it's actually not from our study. It's from our friends at UCLA, and they just released their Hollywood Diversity Report for film, and this is a study that was conducted by Dr. Ana Cristiana Ramon, Michael Tran, and Dr. Darnell Hunt. It's a study they do every year. And when it comes to directors in the United States for feature films, female directors are only 15%, which was actually a little bit of an uptick. And for writers, about 27%, which is a little bit of a uptick. So just, we always compare US with Australia and Europe, and whatnot. So Lisa, could you offer a snapshot for us for the Australian landscape for women working in film and TV? And I think we're going to pull up some slides.
Hi everyone. I am so happy to be at this goddess convention. Looking out, I can definitely see that's what's going on. Madeline, actually it's very similar, I think, everywhere. The data's showing similar kinds of things. And the good news actually more recently is in directing, we're actually doing better than those figures that you just quoted, and we'll have a look at some of the figures in a minute. So one thing I'd say is that women in Australia have always been in the industry. So right back, when Louise Lovely came back from Hollywood, she was able to have a career, and the Madonna sisters are really famous, although from the last film they made in 1932 until the 70s, there weren't any films directed by women in Australia, and probably most people in the room know that there was an interval in production anyway in Australia. So the contemporary industry begins in the 1970s, and it begins with government film funding, which we have to this day, although I think originally it was intended that we would be self-sustaining, and that actually isn't what happened. So that founded a lot of things. In 1979, the Australian Film Commission started the Women's Film Fund, and that was the first one of a whole lot of funds that came to life, mainly in Melbourne and Sydney, in the 1970s and 80s. And that gave women access. They started making films and started to be the people who we are still seeing today. I mean, it's pretty hard being a filmmaker. You really do have to, really want it and be really tenacious. That's the thing I've often told my students, and they think I'm being a bit negative, but I think if you don't really want it with your whole heart, it's a really hard industry to come into. What happened into the 90s is actually the data actually shows a drop, and there was a kind of anti-feminist backlash. There was, we've solved the problem, and the data actually kind of went backwards, and so it had to be built up again. Fortunately, right now, we're in a period where that build-up is happening. So on the screen, you can see a lot of the people that are the women in our industry. Our industry is quite porous across film and television, so often a film, so The Dressmaker, where you can see Jocelyn Moorhouse and Sue Maslin on the top left, that Joss directed television with Secret River, both of which were supported by Gender Matters Task Force, which I've also been on for the whole time as well, the last 2 rounds of task force members, which we'll talk about in a minute. So they're working in both film and television, and it's not a huge industry. Most people tend to know each other. And one of the reasons I put this slide up is I think women look more present than they are because they're so successful. So they, I don't want to use the term punch above their weight, but that's sort of what I mean. They're more successful than their numerical participation. I did some analysis of the AFI Awards, which are now the ACTA Awards, for a 10-year period, and I discovered women were kind of winning them, you know, more of the time. So it looks like there isn't an issue because you see them all the time and they're about. But change has actually been really slow. So in 1991, women were 24% of directors. You know, obviously there's a lot of people who make films, not just directors. And in 2015, they were only 16%. So actually it kind of went backward, and so it's a sort of in bursts, I suppose. So that's one of the reasons why Screen Australia established Gender Matters, that when they looked at the data in 2015, they said, well, it's too slow. And I've been doing this work for decades, and I can tell you for me, it's kind of like it's definitely too slow. So, and the explanation is not in training. Women actually get more degrees, they do more training, they take longer to kind of put their hand up. So they're not the explanation. So Gender Matters started the Gender Matters initiatives. I think there's another slide.
Yeah, you have a few slides. Let's move forward. Did you want to talk about this?
Oh yes, this is just in relation to how successful women are. So they look like there's lots of them, but they are a minority in just about every field. So the person in Australia who's won the most Academy Awards is Catherine Martin, who's a woman, of course, closely followed by Ori Kelly from a long time ago. And I know we were all hoping that Mandy Walker would get one for her work as a DOP on Elvis, and you know she did an amazing job. You know, but that's how it goes, I guess. But women are a tiny minority as directors of photography, and actually a recent study by Amanda Coles at Deakin and Erica Addis leading for the Australian Cinematographers Society showed that cinematographers are not at all diverse, and in fact there's no Indigenous DOPs. So, you know, in some areas it's really bad. Anyway, women are more visible, as this shows. And the next slide, these films are in the top 26 of box office of all times. And so I think what has happened is there are now business arguments, which has got the attention, I guess, of the market, that people want films made by women. Leading female characters are enormously in demand, and they will sell tickets, and they'll do really well. So those things are actually quite important, but they're just 2 examples of this kind of enormous success. And it just shows that films with all women characters are going to do really well in the market, and it sort of, I think it gave a lot of confidence, even though Sue Maslin told me that when they cast Kate Winslet, the marketplace was wanting to know who the male lead was. They kept wanting that information, like as if Kate Winslet wasn't enough. Anyway, it got made, and I have to say, these films, they really speak to me, and it's about kind of seeing things through a female lens and having a female gaze, by which I mean, for my money, every filmmaker has their own, if they identify as a woman, they reflect their own female life experience. And I find more often that those are the films that really speak to me and that, I really go along with. And I know Rachel told me that with Ride Like a Girl, someone said, oh, it's not very feminist or something. And Rachel said, I wanted the audience to go with me. And it doesn't have to do that. Like, it just shows how the Michelle Payne character really wanted to just ride those horses, and she just went out and did it.
Yeah, so I want to turn to Anusha, but just to give you some context, so we did something called the Geena Benchmark Report, and we had looked at films and this is the US, the largest grossing films out of the United States from 2007 to 2017, and we found at the time that female-centric films generated 55% more at the box office. So there's the social imperative, which we're talking about, but there's also a business imperative. So Anusha, over to you. What is the state of the industry for Indigenous women and representation?
Oh, look, what a complex and fantastic question. Look, it is very different and also very the same. So when I look at historically, we are very lucky within the Indigenous sector that from day dot, essentially, majority of our leaders have been women. So it's very different. You look at the ones that propelled us into this, whether it's, Mitch Torres, Arnie Frieda Glynn, to contemporary now, Sally Riley, like our leaders, our decision makers have been women. So it's glad to see you catching up. And then we're also a minority within a minority. So it's, I think for us, women have always led in this area. And now I think it's a really exciting time. We all have to say that at any time in this industry, don't we? Because it is an exciting industry. But it's full of, I guess, ups and downs. You feel like you get 3 steps forward, it's 4 steps back. It's the nature of it. We've seen a huge movement since 2020 that came out of, especially, if I'm talking about in a kind of a broadcaster sense and an investor sense, I saw with that movement, the largest civil rights movements we've ever seen internationally in 2020, it happened very fast, very quick, with broadcasters, with these organisations, entities, everyone, got a diversity inclusion board, if not a diversity inclusion officer, etc., which has been fantastic. It happened so quickly, which was great. It can show that we can make movement and change quickly. But I think in that we also have to be really careful that we're doing that movement and change well. Even the concept of using the words diversity and inclusion, I've been to countries and worked with organisations that refuse to use that terminology anymore. They don't believe it's strong enough. It's anti-racist and equality. And there's still people are still scared to use that terminology. So it shows we have a ways to go. We also, in terms of the diversity within the diversity, we've got to make sure that it's not just cisgendered, able-bodied people of privilege within that as well. So that's my space and my interest. It is absolutely a factor when you come from where I have and talking about the Indigenous sector. We've known for years, for those of you in the room that don't know, National Indigenous Television came out of the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody. That's how we exist, was because it was shown in that how representation on screen can have such a huge impact that is literally life and death. And I think when we saw that movement in 2020, the whole world kind of caught up with that on how important representation is. And we moved through, we've got to keep on guard and having these robust discussions at every level to move forward and move backwards. And so we see these great things on screen, these great success of things like Total Control and, Drover's Wife and Sweet As, all these incredible films that are on our screens and these incredible teams behind it. Yet on the same token this year, we'll also see in our cinemas a film that literally focuses around a woman that doesn't have a name. She's literally called Black Woman, and the whole story is her, in a cage and the brutalization of Black and brown bodies. So every time we think we've moved forward, we've got to also acknowledge that there's, I sat there going, wow, I can't believe this is being made, but also not even just made, invested in. By government funding. It's, we've got to stay in. I always say I'm bitter, but hopelessly hopeful within this industry.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we go to the next slide? And then Anusha, why don't you kick us off as a member of the Gender Matters Task Force? How many of you are familiar with the task force? Show of hands. So not everybody. So Anusha, why don't you explain what the task force is, and then I'll just let you and Lisa talk about what are some of the programs and what have been some of the accomplishments, and then I know we also have some data behind it. But why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So the Gender Matters Task Force formed in 2016. And it kind of expanded. It's continued to grow and expand, and it's volunteer based. It's an advisory. I think the strength in the body is that it's made up. It's made up of women across the sector and unrepresented genders that are working in all different areas of the sector. And I think that's really important, that it's not just people in screen, it's not just investment bodies. We've got people that are CEOs, we've got producers, we've got cinematographers, and that's really important. And I think the strength for me and the joy in working with the task force is that it hasn't been easy. It has been robust discussion, and the changes just in the last, and I don't know if Lisa agrees with me, that I've seen of kind of the line of the Gender Matters Task Force and what we see ourselves of being able to facilitate or support has changed a lot in the 2 years due to those really robust discussions within this group of women.
Let's go to the next slide, because there's a 5-point plan, and I'll leave it up to you or Lisa to walk through that, to explain it.
I will then. There was a 5-point plan put out in the beginning in 2016, and many of you will know about that. The names of those 5 things changed in the second incarnation, and there was a second task force. And as we go along, there's kind of shifts because we're kind of looking at what might need to happen next. So the Women's Story Fund, which I think became Brilliant Stories, meant that what we ended up was this amazing slate of stories ready to go. The Enterprise Women was, what was that? That was the business support to create infrastructure. So there were mentorship schemes. We ran lots of things like that were things like pitching sessions, and often it's kind of cultural that women are kind of a bit less out there, and I attended one of those myself, and we had an American producer that came out to teach it, and I noticed the body language of the women was kind of quite small, and the woman who was the producer from America, she was kind of like, like she was taking up a lot of room, and when people said, well, it's a very culturally worthy story, she said, oh, I want to, I've got to sell it, and those kinds of things were really great. And like anyone in the film industry needs to be able to pitch their work anyway, so it hasn't been about fixing women, it's about extra supports, and we know that the extra supports work because we know from the 80s and 90s that I just talked about, and what Anusha just said about Indigenous filmmaking, which frankly has been the most vibrant side of filmmaking in Australia, in the last 20 years, and it came out of the Indigenous film funds at the Australian Film Commission, and which is now Screen Australia, and first in documentary, and then going into a whole suite of short drama initiatives. So we know that those things propel things along, and some of those films are among my favourite short films ever. So there were attachments for women, and that actually ended up having making some changes in the agency itself. So when they invest more than $500,000, they have to have an attachment for women in it, and all on a policy level, the whole initiative has actually really changed the agenda. So I think it's that thing of that when you overlay the conscious thought in everything you do, and I do some work for UNESCO, and what we call that is gender mainstreaming. So you'd say, well, when you have a short list, is it diverse? Are there women on it? Are there Indigenous people? Are there, there stories with, central protagonists that are diverse and so on? So you kind of constantly do that. So that's really happened, I think, in Screen Australia. But one thing that should be said, this is just one initiative. We have had initiatives for decades and decades and decades, and they haven't massively shifted, and in fact, when Gender Matters started, a lot of them are going backwards. So, one initiative cannot do everything. We need a whole of industry commitment to change, and unless we get that, it's really not going to work. But this makes a dent and is really important. So there was the matched distribution guarantee of up to 300K to enhance marketing. I think that one was sort of not as successful as the other things. And then there was a whole lot of assessment changes. So what we ended up with is, I think we've got some more slides.
Yeah, so in terms of the data and what's been collected, why don't we move forward? Okay.
Yeah, so
Can you see
I can't actually quite see that. So this is a whole of industry response. So the data is better inside Screen Australia for women than it is in the whole industry proper. But this is the whole industry, and by producers, directors, and writers. One of the things that has happened is in the first period. So the way that Gender Matters has worked is it's over a 3-year period. Because, for example, it might be you might have a round where there aren't any women applicants. Well, you can't get a gender balance if that happens. So the idea is like over a whole suite over this 3-year period, and we were really excited that we achieved the KPI. But if you look at this, you can see there's a dip. So there's a kind of a dip going on. One thing I noticed about the data, and the next slide is by each different genre. And documentary going down, I wondered if that was actually about women getting more traction in other kinds of film and television areas, because women are traditionally the biggest group in. They've got the best representation in documentary because they can be the producer, director, writer. They can. They're low funding, and where the big bucks are, they have tended to attract more men. Women have been not able to get as big budgets, and I know the Swedish Film Institute put out a big report about following the money, and they are under Anna Cerner. They really achieved a 50-50, and they had a target. We never have a target in Australia. It's politically not popular. And so it's more, this is what we are trying to do. But if you have a look at it, so I don't know, Anusha, if you want to add anything here.
Yeah, I can't see the slides either. And you've touched on everything that I wanted. That the places where women are kind of over, you know, I wouldn't say overrepresenting, but doing really well, are not ones that, you know, are where the big bucks are and the money is. And that shows a lot as well within our industry, and also reflective of most other industries as well.
Yeah. So what I would say, for example, if you look at the top row here on your left in the middle, which has in feature drama, and if we look at the directors, when Gender Matters started, directors were 16%, and now they're 24%, and that's a lot more than it has been in a long time. And directors is one of the problem areas. There's quite a few kind of all male or female ghettos, and one of the things that the conversations at Gender Matters Task Force have been about is all the below the line areas, and trying to do something about those. And certainly in Victoria, we're expecting to have a lot more work in film and television. There's Netflix have 5 more shows. We have the new soundstage, and we're not going to have enough people if we don't take advantage of using all of our potential workforce, and it's a missed innovation opportunity as well. So
You want to move forward on the slides?
and then there was the last one, which is the successful Screen Australia applications, drama development and production. So the first round of the Gender Matters was only about development, and then in the second round it went to production. And so when you look at that, when we added up all together, the KPI was really successful. It went up, but there is a concern that it's actually going back down again. And sometimes there's this idea that, oh, we've achieved, you know, we did something about that and we'll move on to the next sexy thing. And I really think it's really important that we maintain the focus on gender, because it isn't, 24% of directors is not a lot. And we might be thinking, what's the best way to do something about it? And in my view, the best way to do something about it is get more women in front of and behind the camera, because women are 3 times more likely to tell stories about women. And, you know, that's where we get, you know, this kind of growth, and it's an innovation and an engine.
And just to give you context, we had looked at the 10 largest film markets around the world a number of years ago, and what we found is that when there was the presence of a female writer or director, it was a 7.5% to a 10% uptick in on-screen roles. And you have to think about logically, if you're a storyteller, you're going to tell stories that you either love or you know. So if it's a 5-to-1 ratio of men to women in terms of who's telling the stories, then of course you're not going to see a lot of female presence, you know, on screen. So did you want to talk about your KPIs here, or did you want to move on to some of the supported features from
I think
Gender Matters?
we've covered that. Let's go on and talk about some of the. There's a lot of both film and television, and you know, in all genres that has been supported, and actually television is an area where women have been increasing their presence in Australia. Less so, I guess, in the feature sector, but these are some of the more recently supported features, and I think we were going to have a look at a couple of the clips, and then we throw to Anusha. I think we've got The Drover's Wife and Sweet As.
Sweet As, yeah.
Which are both stories that Leah Purcell has said that her mother was a drover. Not her mother, her great-grandmother was a drover at 15 and had read the story of The Drover's Wife. And it's not the first time a woman has made a film of that, from that story, and made a feminist revision of it either. Sue Brooks did one in the 80s. And Sweet As is a story of a young girl who is troubled and ends up going on this sort of troubled teens photography on country, and apparently Job had that same experience as well. So, you know, these are stories that really come from the heart, but they feature women and tell women's stories. So will we have a look at those?
Yeah, so we have 2 clips. Do we want to roll the first clip?
Mother, I've organised for you to go away. It's some kind of photo safari for at-risk kids.
So lucky.
Hello, everyone.
The camera will be our instrument for telling our stories.
And I wonder, what's yours?
Mother, you're my niece and I love you, all right? But I want you to think about your future. What being independent means. Maybe that's without Mum for a little while, okay?
I've never been kissed.
What? Don't look at me, little perv. You might have got an opportunity here. Don't waste it. How do you know when a guy likes you? What does the photo say about me?
You're strong and brave.
Stop, please.
I don't need any of yous.
How would you feel if we abandoned you?
Been there, done that. Mum! What's next after this, Myra? What do you want? Hello, ancestors.
Where are the girls?
In the book!
Go, now!
Every picture has a story. Take the time to see the story that is in front of you.
You got family here.
Thanks, Uncle. Country offers you so much. Said every picture has a story. Maybe we have one.
I think it's really important to note with that film that essentially the production team and behind the camera was almost exclusively female.
Bravo. So I know we have another clip. Did either of you want to set that up before we show it?
I think I did just before that it's oh no, I didn't, did I? It's the story of Molly Johnson, the drover's wife, and it's unusual actually because Leah Purcell began it with it in the theatre. It became a film and it's going to be an opera, and I think it's something else as well. So it's kind of having this really long, rich life in a range of forms. But in this story, it's quite lovely. You know, both of them look beautiful, and we have this wonderful, strong female character who, you know, drives it along. And Leah Purcell's done such a fantastic job here. So let's have a look at that one, please.
Fight for my children, fight for my life, I will. I love watching my Joe cantering across the flats. Sun setting behind him, children running to greet him. Waving his hat with joy on seeing them. He's been away 3 months.
Mrs. Joe Johnson. I'm worried about her. She's alone.
Molly Johnson grew up out here. She knows the ways.
I'm just a drover's wife. But cross me and I'll kill you. I'll shoot you where you stand and I'll bury you where you fall. My children need me. They need their mother. I love yous.
Love you, Mama!
Always with you.
Welcome to Everton. Little more than you bargained for. Walking straight into a murder investigation.
6 people dead.
Probably a Narrago man, sir.
Are you a bad man then?
I think I am. Yaraka of the Guguyimira. It is you.
Oh, word travels fast around here.
State your business.
I drive with Joe. Except this drive he didn't show. First time in 8 years.
You're a good man.
Come with me.
Did you believe her, Molly Johnson? Her husband waving his hat and seeing the children.
Somehow it didn't ring true.
rights, too many guns now.
This land needs law.
You dare look a white man in the eye, Jackie?
Fight for my children, fight for my life, I will.
Whilst hunting savages, please do not turn into one.
It is you.
I'm just a drover's wife.
Anusha, is there anything you wanted to say about this?
Oh no, what's to say? I mean, Leah Purcell, what an absolute fall. We were kind of all waiting within the industry for this to hit the screens, and it did, and to do all those roles. I mean, I don't know how she did it. She spent so long, the success of it as a stage play, and the handling of so many complex issues, so beautifully done. When Lisa's talking about, the way women address these issues and stories is so different. It's so important. You look at even Sweet As, there are so many, even though it's kind of like this teen and it's kind of in lots of ways it's light and there's so much joy in that film, there's touches on so many big issues around, everything from the very basic, not basic, but, mother-daughter issues, but also to, grooming, to inappropriate relationships, all of that kind of stuff, but dealt so beautifully with and so important. And that speaks, I think, to the fact that there was a very much a choice by Jab and her team to make it an almost exclusively female production team, and that was able to then make that safety and that kind of film, there it is at Berlin winning. So how wonderful it works.
So I know we're going to jump to Q&A, but before we do, what's next? What's going to happen next year, the year after? What's next for the task force?
Well, the task force will be renewed, and there'll be a new one announced shortly. And as I said, I think it'll go below the line. One thing I didn't mention, which is actually important, is that Gender Matters funding can be accessed by men, as long as the film that they're working on have the 3 ticks of the number of women that are in it. So there'll be a new KPI for Gender Matters. What will happen in the rest of the industry? There's lots of great initiatives like the Natalie Miller Foundation, which is running developing women's careers, and especially in areas like exhibition and distribution, where they haven't had much of a go. So it will keep going on. It needs to go on. I hope it. I think inclusion more broadly is really necessary, but I wouldn't want to lose the focus on gender as well.
Anusha?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it'll be really exciting when the new task force is announced. Unfortunately, I've got no spoilers on that, but I think if the task force has grown and the diversity within that task force continues to grow at a rapid rate, and depending on that new task force where we go to, I do agree with Lisa. I think we are, definitely with us as the outgoing, we were definitely starting to focus on below the line. As anyone who's working in the industry right now, we have critical shortages within crews, etc. And we also, so many of us, especially women working in the sector, have or know of so many horror stories of unsafe behaviour as well. And I think we're rapidly changing, and the conversation around that and the expectations around safe environments on set has changed rapidly. Thank God, because this was so important. Because I look in personally the amount of people I know, and especially women who've left the industry because awful things happened. So we've got to change that rapidly, and that's about changing the ethos and definitely working in that below the line space. And I think we're already making a lot of headway there with big projects, attachments, streamers coming on board to offer incredibly useful attachments that aren't just kind of flash in the pants kind of attachments, where there's a real kind of knowledge and understanding and sharing. We're going to see a whole heap of growth in the industry, hopefully, cross fingers.
For anyone in the audience who wants to apply, or where do they go?
Screen Australia.
Okay.
Or the funding
Yep.
agencies also are looking at inclusion and diversity as well. Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add to the whole thing is that we also need our male champions of change, and many men have also been driving. They don't want those things to happen on set, and they are also kind of like, I think Rob Connolly was involved with Jub's film, though, you know, they're actually a really important resource too. So we go out into the greater industry and say, come on everybody, like, everybody's got to lift their game and make a real commitment.
Great. So I think we have some microphones in the audience. Does anyone have any Q&A? Anyone have any questions? A little hard to see here. Up? Down here? Okay. Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, I'm Megan. So happy to be here. You're my heroes. A lot of the problem that we have in every industry, but obviously in the screen industry especially, is the motherhood penalty, being that women are out of the workforce due to becoming parents or carers. In order to change that, obviously things need to change for men, so men need to take up more caring roles. And to have an outcome where that can happen, we also need to see representation of that in film and across the arts industries. How do we achieve that so we can have that outcome, so showing stories about men in caring roles whilst still showing stories about women? How do we achieve that outcome whilst not losing women's stories? Because a lot of the gender equity space at the moment is about getting those male champions of change and asking them to ask the questions and them to tell their stories about those caring roles and the things that they're doing. And that's definitely an outcome that we need, but at the same time, we don't want to then lose the female stories. How can we achieve both? Because it feels like it's up to us, and being predominantly women in the room, it's up to us to do both. How do we achieve that while still telling our stories?
So it's interesting you bring that up. We last year released a study on the portrayal of men as caregivers in United States TV, and it's on our website cjane.org. And what we found is that although there is a dramatic increase in showing men as being involved in caregiving, this is U.S. TV, it's very gendered. So they're changing a light bulb. You know, they're raking the yard, you know, where the more traditional caregiving tasks still fall upon women. The other thing is that there's a lot of tropes and stereotypes. So what we found is that the fathers are shown as like bumbling idiots, like they'll drop the baby, you know, things like that. So I think for anyone who is writing any kind of narrative, whether it's episodic, you know, really think about how you're portraying the men as caregivers and balancing, you know, that kind of narrative, because it's reinforcing those tropes and stereotypes. So I can only speak to it, you know, from what's happening in the make-believe world, and maybe Lisa and Anusha, you can talk about what's happening in terms of, you know, policy or, you know, anything else that's happening over here.
Well, I did do some research on the sort of the makeup of people in the industry. It's a bit old now, it's 2012, but there was a problem with, you know, women having left to be caregivers, and the problem is them getting back in. So we definitely need kind of start-up kind of initiatives for women who've taken time out, or men as well. And I think in terms of representation, if they weren't bumbling idiots, because I think it's a cultural norm too. I know when my children were small, if my husband was out with the children, or one of them, some woman would always say, "You need help," which he didn't, and he used to take great offence at. So it's not easy, but I think one of the big solutions is a question of leadership. Leadership really matters, that our leaders take on what can we do about the barriers and where they're particularly dominant. It's pretty, as I said, it's a really hard industry, so the women that get back in will be the ones that really, want to be there and will be, important figures. So we need to support them. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but maybe Anusha's got something to add.
Oh, look, I think it's really interesting, and I think we need to be very careful. For me, and talking about behind the scenes, not on screen, I can't be responsible, to try and work out that kind of other people's lens or language is difficult. All you can kind of do is control what you can. And there's been great research, actually. It's US research by Victoria Budson about unconscious bias and bias in the workplace. And that, I think, absolutely, and I studied that while I was actually producing. That's really important. And what she says is, we can't change how people view or see us, and especially motherhood and women in the workplace. What we can do is know that that's out there, so make it more visible. So just really basic things of, if a woman's, if a female producer isn't on set or in the production room, there's an assumption, and if she has children, there is an assumption that she's gone to pick up the kids, or she's got it. Whereas with a male father that's in the room and he's not present, he's seen that that's a positive as well. Oh, he's gone to pick up the kids. Amazing. How incredible. So kind of getting in front of those biases, I think we can, is as a woman, and if you're not hoping to change the whole world, is to be very forthright. So we used to, in production studios, I'd have like whiteboards out the front going, this is where this person is, this is where I am, I'm in this meeting from here to there, to just be very clear, because it is about bias, it is about the conscious and unconscious bias, and we know that it's out there. So kind of taking control of it as much as you can, I think, is really important. And, it's see-do learning. I was inspired by the women within this industry that just did it and got it done, and were breastfeeding on set, and if you see people do it, then it's an option, and other people will know it's an option regardless of gender as well. So it's really important to look after those people within the industry, and also yourself, and the conversation around it as well, and being very clear, even if that does mean having whiteboards out in front of the production studio, making sure that people know where you are.
And also, I think we need new ways of working. So I know the producer on Stateless, what she did was she job shared. So she was half the week and someone else was half the week, so that she could have the career she wanted, but not really impact profoundly on her very, very small children. So, we have to think of doing things differently.
So I know we're out of time, so I just wanted to thank Anusha, I wanted to thank Lisa, and there's another panel, Seeing Ourselves on Screen, is going to start in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.